So I want to start with this. A lot of the things that you actually are describing in full detail in terms of the idealized man, let's say, or male, and the idealized woman or female, and I think you mean it and understood in the kind of traditional binary paradigm. I'm only specifying that not to downplay it, but to emphasize it because for the point I'm about to make.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the things that you're talking about are still socially constructed, and they have the same kind of arbitrariness that I was trying to say before. And so I anticipate that to whatever extent you were pushing back on the arbitrariness before, that a lot of those things would apply to some of the things that we're now discussing. But like the set of attributes that comprises the ideal man or the ideal male actually varies by society. It's not even uniform across cultures. I think that's one way of getting real quick at one fact, which is that a lot of that stuff is socially constructed, and we can tell because it's contingent upon what the paradigms or dominant ideas in a society or given culture even are. If you travel to certain places of the globe, certain attributes that are associated with maleness would be more emphasized there than other places. There may be certain things that we may hear in the West associate more with females that in other places are actually associated with males. So you have so one example off the top of my head, and forgive my ignorance because I know very little. I understand this at a basic level. Is I believe it's called the kilt that are worn by what culture is that? Oh my god,
Scottish.
I'm blanking. Yeah, the Scottish culture, and that's something that resembles a skirt in the West. Well, I guess Scotland kind of consists of the West, but here in the United States in particular, that people who don't understand the cultural relevance of that may associate that with the skirt because it looks very similar. Skirts are associated generally with women. It's a form of dress that is associated with femininity for various different reasons. But that is actually a very masculine thing to wear. And it has a lot of cultural salience that if you're not a part of that culture and you don't learn about it, it might go over your head. That might be an example of that illustrates that even the things that are traditionally or generally associated with either sex or either end of
Mm-hmm.
the gender spectrum, if you want to put it that way, that's not even uniform. And you can do that with a lot of different aspects or things that are associated with men and women. All of that to say that there are going to be people, presumably in any given culture, in any given cultural context, who may be, in some sense, I want to use these terms carefully because I don't want to be pejorative. They, in
Mm-hmm.
some sense, maybe deviate from the expectations and the social pressures that kind of keep these expectations in line, or in some sense perpetuate them. Um, it makes sense why a person or why several people who don't quite fit these paradigms through no fault of their own um, would perceive those as in some sense oppressive because it restrains the ways with which they can express themselves, the ways with which
Mm-hmm.
they can present themselves in public places without being bullied, without being discriminated against, etc. I think that is the core of what drives the non-binary and trans activists to the extent that they're not being toxic. Because
Okay.
I have a lot to say about the toxicity with which they
Yeah.
I want you to but before we go there, because we're gonna get into it and we're gonna get into the
Yeah.
documentary specifically, but I want to kind of start us with that because I do think
Cool.
that's a fair way to steel man the other side.
I think so as well. But I have two things to say about that. I think one, first of all, the difference is not in kind, but in degree. And two, um, even within a specific culture, those expectations are not uniform.
Right.
Do you
Okay.
understand
So
what I
let's
mean by
start with the
this?
first. Yeah, I do. We'll start with the first one though, because I don't know that I understand the first point you made. What do you
So
mean by?
when we're talking about differences as far as the expectations of males within a culture across the world, those there are what's it called, very common themes. There are themes that we see reoccurring over and over and over and over again, and the degree to which each one of those themes is emphasized within a culture varies in degree rather than in kind. There are no cultures, like at least large cultures that have existed for a long time, where men are expected to handle child rearing. I'm sure there are some modern examples that have been made possible through the advent of non-physical work, which it hasn't really been that long since we've been able to take advantage of like fuel sources to use power that's beyond what your body can produce in a single day.
What do you mean?
It's so
But sorry, I want to clarify something. What do you mean men are not expected? So like child rearing is a vague term. It
okay. So
encompasses a lot of different
essentially,
things.
yeah. So what I mean by that is essentially being the primary caregiver for an infant and a child up until to the point where they can sort of be relatively independent.
So single
It,
fathers don't exist.
they do, but that is sort of that is not the ideal sort of situation we're looking for, and also it's a very rare case.
Yeah,
Like
I think it
it's not
is
that.
typically rare because I think it's
But if we're
rare
talking
to your
about
point.
couples, which I mean, at this point now, like half of kids in this country are raised by a single
Well,
parent.
I think okay. One of the reasons I
But
think it's rare is because there are there are a lot of typically. So first of all, and it may be controversial to say this, but I'm trying to be fair to both sides, and this is going to be awkward. Human human males cannot give birth to children, right? Um, they anybody who does not have the relevant anatomy necessary or required to give birth, a uterus, ovaries, all of that stuff, um, a womb, etc. They cannot give birth in virtue of that. I think that even the most staunchest radical trans activist types have to admit that fact of biology, right? That's what I mean when I say human males can't give birth. Um, and it's not because of some kind of um, biological condition or something. Um, it's not in virtue of that. It's in virtue of the fact that their anatomy has never been the relevant anatomy that human males have cannot produce children. They can produce them in the form of providing the seed or
the,
sperm cells,
the
but
male
not but
gamete.
that but yeah, exactly. But they can't produce them um, in their bodies as human females can. Now, the fact that I had to be very careful about that insofar as I'm trying to accommodate the kinds of language that people who are proponents of the gender ideology we mean to discuss kind of use. It's kind of part of what I mean to talk about and kind of part of what ruffles my feathers. But
Hmm.
I said that to say that one of the reasons I think it's rare for men to be the primary caregivers is because actually their biology, and by men here I'm using it in the more traditional binary term, talking about human males. Their biology actually isn't even sufficient to care for them in terms of like men typically don't produce the breast milk. I know that there are certain circumstances in which males can produce milk, but it's typically human females, and it's typically in virtue of the fact that they were just pregnant that it triggers certain causal mechanisms that actually make their breasts enlarge and they start lactating and stuff like that. That's like a biological function. Men, that doesn't happen in men just because I don't know women around them are pregnant. Like that's not typically how it happens. And again, I'm
Hmm.
using men as to refer to human male temporarily. We'll go back to the different ways in which the term man and woman are used in this context, in this
Hmm.
discourse. So I think that's part of one of the things that contributes to it. But like we could easily imagine a society in which men, um, beyond the practicalities of not being able to produce breast milk and things like that, still were heavily involved in child rearing. That's not impossible. Um,
Um,
and and the last point I want to arrive at is like child rearing, actually men play a vital role in child rearing generally, although I don't know that they play a vital role in the early stages of it when it comes to like nursing and things like that, to be fair. And so like when you say that men are not, we don't have any cultures where men are responsible for child rearing, I feel like that's not quite accurate. But I think what you're talking about are primarily things like that are associated with like nursing, like breastfeeding, and all the other stereotypical things that we do associate in the West with women and with mothers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to clarify as well that I'm talking about within a relationship, in which, a couple produces a child. We
Uh-huh.
don't have. I don't think that there are really any cultures out there where the man is the primary caregiver, and I think that's not an arbitrary thing because of something that I mentioned earlier, being that pregnancy is something that usually interrupts careers. And when you're looking at, especially careers that are highly technical, usually any interruption will actually cause you to fall behind, and you will fall behind not only in your know-how but in your income capacity, as well as other types of work where you I'm sure employers are more likely to, what's it called, at least employers look at gaps in employment and things like that, and a
Uh-huh.
man who doesn't have to have a gap in employment is more marketable in the job market than he would be if he had several ones. And this is
Or
why
women
that,
who don't, and women who don't have children.
or women who don't have children. And actually we see the same phenomenon actually play itself out in income statistics. If you look at the, Bureau of Labor statistics or census data,
Uh-huh.
the highest earning class of people in the country, and I'm sure it's like this around the world, are men
Uh-huh.
who are married, followed by women who have never married, who have never had children, followed by men who have never married, had never had children, and at the bottom of the totem pole, these are the people who make up most of part-time jobs, who have the least labor participation and the lowest income, are women who have children but have never married or don't have a partner. It's like these are things that we see shake out in real world application. It's
Uh-huh.
like, and I don't think that's
But would it,
arbitrary at all. It's really a function of the reality that comes
well,
along with the
but it's,
lifestyle choices.
and if arbitrary is the term that's going to trip us up, we can maybe use a different term. But it is a facet of the ways in which we have organized our society, at least partially. That is something that contributes to that. We do not have to organize our society in such a way where competition is the main determining, or one of the biggest determining factors for where your lot in life is going to be in terms of your earning potential and whatnot. We could imagine a society that was organized in such a way that actually was very, very accommodating to pregnant women, such that even though they had to have maternity leave and various things like that, they could still continue their career trajectories, and society would function just fine. And in
I
fact,
mean,
there's been strong advocacy and various pushes in corporate America and elsewhere, to actually or reorganize the structures of our society and the structures with which we organize our companies and corporations and things like that, to allow for that, to allow for women to go on maternity leave, and even men to go on maternity leave and then come back and their jobs waiting for them, for example. And I think we're starting to see that more now, more than we've ever seen it before, even though the trends that you just described, I think, are generally still true. um, and so, to me, that signals the kind of thing I was getting at before, which is the social construct thing is a very contingent thing. It depends on how we organize our society, and there doesn't seem to be any necessity to the ways with which things are now. And if that's true, then I think that the those who have the kind of critique of the gender binary that they have some bit of a point, in that what they're part of what they're recognizing is we don't have to structure our society in the way that we do, right? We can structure our society in a way that's more accommodating to people who don't quite fit into these boxes nicely. And indeed, I think that they would go further to say we have a moral obligation to do so, because that's more inclusive, right? We have a moral obligation to organize a society in such a way where it doesn't discriminate against anybody, including those who are non-binary, or those who are trans, or those who don't quite fit into the gender binary paradigm quite nicely. um, can you
um,
at least recognize the validity
I
of,
would
of
say
that kind of argument?
that that argument hinges on the assumption that that moral conception is actually most beneficial, and I would actually have to see where what the origins are of that moral conception, and what are its actual
Well, I mean,
axioms, and
I
whether or
think,
not those are even valid.
well, I think
Um,
that they would think of it as analogous to what I would argue, and I think you might agree, that we had a moral obligation to organize our society in such a way that didn't discriminate against Black people.
uh, I mean, is it true that? because as far as we go right now, there are a lot of people who claim that people are still actually. As a matter of fact, let me go at it this way. I don't think discrimination can be centrally planned. Like I don't think you have the ability to centrally plan whether or not people discriminate. And I
Okay.
don't think it's the same thing as the actual conception of
Well,
bigotry. Whether or
okay.
not you hate someone doesn't necessarily dictate
So
whether or not you'll what's it called, discriminate against them.
I don't know what centrally planned is supposed to mean the way you
Well, you're
used it.
talking about
What I'll push
organizing a
back is
society.
right in general, but I don't. But we don't centrally plan our society like that. Usually,
But
our
how would you
society has a
organize?
bunch of different. Our society is actually layered. So our society we have local municipalities, then we have state jurisdictions, and then we have federal jurisdictions. You know that, right? So we have a confluence of a lot of different organizational structures at different levels, and they actually interact with each other in a lot of nuanced ways, and sometimes they're unpredictable. We don't centrally plan the structures of our society in that way. So you've introduced a concept that I wasn't even trying to evoke. I wasn't trying to make it seem as though that we when I say we organize our society, I don't mean that there's only one entity that does all the organization. That's not what I mean. The way we organize our
It
society
doesn't
is
have to be an
actually
entity. Just to clear up, not necessarily
okay, but
just
what
an
I mean is
entity, but
it's
a
not
singular
centrally
idea.
planned. Okay, but what I'm
But
saying
it
is it's
has
not
to come
centrally
off of
planned in
a
the sense.
singular ideal, doesn't it?
No, not necessarily. So the way our society works, there are a lot of ideals that are popular and a lot of ideals that are widespread, but they're not
Hmm.
uniform across the nation, right? You have
Hmm.
certain pockets of our society, certain states, let's say, that are against abortion. You have certain states that are very much accommodating for abortion. That's just one example.
Hmm.
I can give you a million more, right? So we don't have uniformity even of ideas in our society. We don't even have uniformity in terms of the structure of our society, right? We don't have the same laws, exactly the same laws that apply to every single facet of our society. There are certain laws that vary by degree or by the level of punishment, by what the status of them are considered. Like, for example, whether something counts as a felony versus a misdemeanor, that can, depending on what it is, that can vary from state to state, etc. So there's a lot of nuance there.
We have federal jurisdiction though, as far as like racial discrimination or protected
Exactly,
class and things like
exactly.
that.
But
That is a
but we didn't.
uniform
But we
like
didn't
attempt to
always.
organize society.
But we didn't always. That actually is a product of the fact that what we started seeing, especially during the civil rights movement, was one of the main pushes of this in our society. Is people were pushing back against the idea that states had the right to inculcate into their laws or instantiate into their laws forms of legal discrimination against certain people. That was a big part of what the civil rights movement was advocating against. And so there we felt that there was a need to federalize and actually add constitutional amendments to our constitution to make it the case that nobody's going to be discriminated on the basis of immutable characteristics such as race, etc. Right? And I think that a lot of the gender non-binary people that we're tacitly referring to in this discussion, what they're seizing on is what they think of as something analogous to that, which is that in the same way that we have a moral obligation to organize our society in such a way that we don't discriminate against black people, we don't discriminate against the disabled, we don't discriminate against old people, etc. We shouldn't discriminate against people who don't fit into the gender binary either. That and
Um,
so and so if you're going to question the morality of that, then it's not obvious how you can get away from questioning the morality of an analogous principle when it comes to in these other identities.
so are you referring to the 14th when you're talking about the
That's
amendments
one of them.
added? Are you
That's
talking
one
about
of
the
them.
14th Amendment? Well, I mean that
That's one of them.
predates the
Yeah.
civil rights movement.
No, true, 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 true.
But if we're
No,
talking about like
sorry.
the Civil Rights Act, for example.
Let me clarify. You're right.
Yeah.
So those amendments do predate the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement added the voting rights bill in 1965, right?
Hmm.
Um, but the civil rights movement was a part of a general abolition movement, and the abolition movement was part of what thrusted in the 13th, 14th, and I think 15th amendments, right? So that was post Civil War. So I
Yeah.
didn't say that
About
explicitly, but I'm thinking that
okay.
as a part of that tradition.
I'm getting you. I think things like the Civil Rights Act, for example, even went like beyond that to the point where they essentially legitimize the use of things like disparate impact, like the like for example, when you see a disparity within an industry, you can now sue on a federal level with the EEOC. Um, I believe that's what it is. Equal opportunity. I forgot what the acronym is exactly. But you can sue just based on the fact that there is a disparity in racial makeup of in a certain company or in a certain industry or whatever it may be, without even actually having a harmed party. I think that's an overstep when it comes to legislation in that manner, and I think it actually makes an attempt to equalize the ground and actually central. I think that is also what I mean when I say centrally planning a society's you know beliefs and like a level of discrimination. Um, and it's like when you make attempts to do that, it can backfire. There are second and third order consequences that come along with that. Like for example, what's a good one? Oh yeah, affirmative action, for example, where it's essentially there's an assumption that the disparity in itself comes from discrimination, which is something that I believe that you would have to actually prove logically in the first place to make that assumption. It's not something that you can just make. You can just assume. We have examples from other countries where that's not really the case. Um, but affirmative action in the workplace and affirmative action in schools have second order consequences that actually hurt some of the candidates that it's supposed to help. One example of that is, if you're looking at affirmative action colleges and you look at the graduation rates for affirmative action students and non-affirmative action students, and you compare the states that have removed those laws, like for example in California, and what you see is that protected class, once the affirmative action programs are removed, their graduation rates go up because they're actually starting to be matched with schools that are more appropriate
So,
for their level.
but can you just do me a favor, establish the relevance of it? Because we're getting into
Yeah,
affirmative
we're
action and
going.
race, but I want to go back
So
to gender.
I just
So
wanted to
what is
give an
the
example as far as like what are the second and third order consequences of trying to apply laws in ways that are overreaching it for a specific goal. Because I
but how's
think
that germane to
what
the gender discussion?
where you're talking about organizing a society in order to accommodate for certain lifestyle choices that are different from the typical. And what I'm trying to
Well,
say is that it's not
that's not quite
obvious.
how I
I don't
put
think.
this.
I'm sorry. What?
That's not quite how I put it. I'm saying organize a society in such a way where we don't discriminate against
Yeah, but
people.
that's my entire point. Like that is an accommodation in order not to discriminate. But my point is that controlling how people discriminate is not something I think can be effectively done without causing other huge problems that may even be getting to a point of diminishing returns. Because if like, let me go back to an example that you gave earlier, as far as like pregnant women and the job waiting for them after they come back. The job may be waiting for them, but the field, the knowledge base, the market is not waiting for them. That employee is not, and especially if they choose, which is actually rarer than we actually usually discuss. People who have children, women who have children, generally tend to spend a lot more time worrying about their child, doing things for their child, and with their child. That person is no longer completely dedicated as far as like the time spent on that work compared to someone who has a partner who specializes in child rearing while they're taking on the role of focusing on increasing their progress as far as their income capacity or their mastery of a certain skill. Like that's not something that you can just legislate away or um, what's it called, or introduce benefits at work to. That's not going to go away.
Yeah, you
Like
can. You can systematize all kind. You can have all kinds of incentives
in
to
but
organizations
but
that
like you
that
can
that
give them more
accommodate
money,
women like this.
but
You can
it
do you can
still
do all
wouldn't.
kinds of things. You can give them tax exemptions. You can force them by or mandate it by law. I don't know how effective it would be,
Oh
but you
no,
could. There's all kinds of things that you can do, or you can
I don't mean
advocate
forcing the
and
policy
change
is
the
the problem.
cultural milieu around how it's. Or you can advocate and change the cultural milieu around how it's viewed, so that it's actually more grassroots in nature and not top down. There's a lot of different things you can do in terms of
Wait,
in
wait,
terms
wait,
of
hold on,
in
because
terms of
I'm talking
changing
about.
changing the mechanisms of society in such a way where it's more accommodating to women in a
But how
situation
would
such as you described.
you how would you
But
change
also,
the
we're not even
mechanism of
just talking.
society? in order to stop
Well, I
the
just gave you
progress of
several
a certain.
ways.
No, no, but I'm asking a very specific, what's it called, the progress of a field technologically, or as
You don't have
far
to
as like,
stop. You don't have to stop the progress of a certain field. So, for example,
but
like the
that
innovation
person's
can continue.
progression, yeah, but that person's progression is not going to be the same as someone who didn't have who had an interrupted career. It's not going to be the same.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be in order for them to
But
still
if they're
be able
competing,
to have the hold on,
who,
let me finish. It doesn't have to in order for them to be able to still have their career and still make progress after whatever however long it took them to step away, have their child, sharing some of the child rearing responsibilities, etc. Women do it all the time in America, actually, and it's becoming more common now than it ever has been. Some women would think that would argue that, particularly the feminists would argue that that's progress, but that there's more progress to be made because of the trends that you cited earlier, which is that women who have children overwhelmingly um, find their careers being interrupted in a fairly permanent sense, particularly the most male dominated areas of the economy.
I mean, I don't disagree with that, but my opinion is that uh, if you're going to hire people, you're gonna have to discriminate, and discrimination is not inherently a bad thing. Even choosing a sexual
Well,
partner situation,
insofar as
even
okay,
choosing to have me as a guest, you had to choose and discriminate in certain people that you would never have on the podcast.
everybody
Not
else said no.
inherently a bad
You were not my first
thing.
choice.
Anyone that said
I'm
yes.
kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Oh man,
No,
but
no.
no,
Okay, I understand what you mean. I understand what you mean. But to me,
but
that's to
yeah,
equivocate on what we mean by discrimination. We mean it in the pejorative sense. We mean it in built into it when we're talking about it in political context. We're talking about unjust
uh
discrimination.
huh,
Typically, discrimination based on arbitrary or immutable characteristics or arbitrary facts about you. Um, if you're going to discriminate, like for example, if I wanted to select between two possible, I don't know, people that I want to date or whatever,
yeah,
I may choose the one who I find more attractive and then choose against the one who I find less attractive. You can describe that in terms of the denotative meaning of the word discrimination as a form of discrimination. I'm not denying that there is a use of that word that is consistent with that. What we mean are such examples more akin to if I'm choosing between two candidates for a job and I choose the one that's white over the one that's black because built into my psychology or because I've internalized a bunch of social norms that favor the person with white skin over the person with black skin, despite the fact that that doesn't have any obvious connection with their ability
yeah.
to do the job,
Mhm.
right? That's the kind of discrimination that we are against. And what I think the non-binary crowd are talking about and the trans activist types are talking about is we have forms of discrimination based on gender identity in society that are akin to the second example and less akin to the first example. And that's why it's problematic, because the people who get screwed are the non-binary and trans people.
Um, and I would. Well, okay. First of all, as far as like that type of discrimination specifically, there are costs that you have to pay for as a person who's discriminating against qualified talent, which is a rare thing. I think we can both agree on that. Qualified people who work very well and are interested in doing the best for your customer, they don't grow on trees. Um, Anybody who's done any recruiting knows. So for you to use some sort of weird characteristic like that as far as judgment of employment, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Someone else is going to hire that person, at least your
Not
competitor or whatever
necessarily,
it may be.
because you can have well, not
You,
in general. I understand what you're saying, but not necessarily, because you can have a pool of applicants who the differences between their ability to do the work actually isn't that different. And if you're going to discriminate against a white qualified person and a black qualified person, let's say that their qualifications are exactly the same by whatever metric you want to use, right? But you choose the white person because they're white. That's still a form of discrimination, consistent with the fact that you're still out of your pool of talent, you're still getting the same quality of worker.
and how would we? I just want to know what kind of talent pool are we talking about here? Because if you're competing with other businesses, I don't think there is such a thing as such an ample talent pool that you are able to just freely discriminate based on color without having to run into some issues. It's like
What I'm
if
saying
we're
is that
talking
it
about,
is definitely possible.
it's
It's definitely
possible, but
possible because a
it's
lot of the
possible, but
because
I
a lot
don't
of the talent pools for
think
a lot of
that's
different forms of employment are not are wide. Some of them are the more specialized you get, then the pool is shortened for sure,
yeah,
right? But then what usually
like
happens
education, for
systemically is
example.
that the people who are eligible, but the people who are eligible at the higher levels, because of a whole bunch of systemic factors, tend to be less and less likely to be non-white, and there's a whole bunch of systemic reasons for that. And so like
Wait, I'm
it's more
sorry. Can you
complicated
repeat
than
that?
just having two candidates. Because of a whole bunch of systemic factors, there are going to be sectors of our economy or whatever
Hmm.
where people are searching for talent, and the more specialized they get, right, there are less and less black people to even have the opportunity, right? So one example of this would be head coaches in the NFL, right? Just one off the top of my head, right? It's not that we don't have a whole bunch of black people who could be head coaches in the NFL, but like when you start getting to the upper echelon, because of a whole bunch of systemic factors, there's less and less black people at that level to even be candidates for that position for various different systemic reasons, right? And so it makes the whole discussion more complicated because it's not just a matter of, oh, I have a white candidate and I have a black candidate, and the discrimination takes the form of choose the white one over the black one because racism, right? It's a lot of it is like built into like whether or not black people can even be a part of the pool in the first place, because you have to jump through all the hoops, you have to get through all the credentials, you have to get through all the experience, etc. Right? Like that's part of the landscape of the kinds of systemic forms of discrimination or oppression or racism that a lot of people have in mind. Now, to bring it back to gender, though, because we've been talking for almost a whole hour and haven't really touched the documentary. What all I'm trying to do is analogize like the what people have in mind in terms of this discourse are
Mhm.
those kinds of factors that negatively implicate trans and non-binary people in virtue of the fact that they are admitting of gender identities that are non-standard and that in some sense uh, deviate from what they call the gender binary, and they view it as oppressive inherently in virtue of these tensions that I'm trying to describe. And they're not simple. They're actually very multifaceted and complex because of the nature of how our society is organized. The organizational structure of our society is itself nuanced and complex. It's extremely complex, right? Which is why I objected to your centralization thing, because it to me felt like you were oversimplifying how our society is organized.